When people talk about the Beatles, the spotlight almost always falls on John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Their songwriting changed popular music forever, and their chemistry created one of the greatest catalogs in history. But behind almost every groundbreaking Beatles recording stood another extraordinary talent, George Martin. Often called the Fifth Beatle, Martin was far more than a producer. He was a classically trained composer, an arranger, an orchestrator, and a creative problem solver who could transform the band's wildest ideas into reality. Time and time again, when the Beatles imagined something that seemed impossible to record, George Martin found a way to make it happen. These 6 songs are perhaps the greatest examples of his remarkable genius. Number 6, In My Life.
In my life, I've loved them all.
At first glance, In My Life sounds like a simple and heartfelt reflection on memory and love, yet one of its most unforgettable moments exists because of George Martin. John Lennon wanted something that sounded like an old Baroque keyboard piece for the instrumental break. Instead of bringing in a harpsichord player, Martin came up with a clever solution. He performed the solo on a piano at half speed. When the tape was played back at normal speed, the piano suddenly took on the bright, elegant character of a harpsichord. The result was magical. It became one of the most recognizable solos in the Beatles' catalog and demonstrated Martin's extraordinary ability to solve musical problems through studio innovation rather than expensive equipment or complicated technology. Sometimes the simplest ideas become the most brilliant. Number 5. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite.
The benefit of Mr. Kite, there will be a show tonight on Tramp.
When John Lennon brought Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite into the studio, he had one clear request. He wanted listeners to feel as though they had walked into a Victorian circus. There was only one problem. No one knew how to create that sound. George Martin refused to settle for ordinary circus music. Instead, he recorded organ performances, cut the tapes into dozens of tiny pieces, threw them into the air, and stitched them together in random order. The strange collage of sounds created an atmosphere that was playful, chaotic, mysterious, and completely unforgettable. Even today, more than half a century later, the recording still sounds like nothing else out there. It perfectly captured Lennon's imagination, not by copying reality, but by creating an entirely new sonic world. Number 4. Eleanor Rigby.
Look at all the lonely people.
Few Beatles songs marked a bigger artistic leap than Eleanor Rigby. Paul McCartney had written a moving song about loneliness, but George Martin gave it a completely unique musical identity. Instead of guitars, drums, or a full rock band, Martin arranged the song for 8 string players. Drawing inspiration from film composer Bernard Herrmann, he instructed the musicians to play with sharp attacks and almost no vibrato, creating an intense and dramatic sound that mirrored the isolation in the lyrics. The strings didn't simply accompany Paul's voice, they became another storyteller. Without George Martin's arrangement, Eleanor Rigby might still have been a wonderful song, but it almost certainly wouldn't have become one of the defining recordings of the 1960s. Number 3. Tomorrow Never Knows.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream.
Perhaps no Beatles song better captures the fearless creativity of the studio than Tomorrow Never Knows. John Lennon had an idea that sounded impossible. He wanted his voice to resemble, as he famously described it, the Dalai Lama singing from a mountaintop. For many producers, that request would have ended the conversation. For George Martin, it was simply another challenge. Working alongside engineer Geoff Emerick, Martin experimented with tape loops, reversed recordings, manipulated sound effects, and a rotating Leslie speaker that transformed Lennon's voice into something otherworldly. The finished recording sounded as though it had arrived from the future. Its influence can still be heard in psychedelic rock, electronic music, ambient recordings, and modern studio production. Number 2. Strawberry Fields Forever.
Let Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to...
Even by Beatles standards, Strawberry Fields Forever presented an enormous challenge. John Lennon loved two completely different versions of the song. One was slow and dreamy, the other was faster, richer, and recorded in a different key. Instead of asking Lennon to choose, George Martin attempted something many engineers believed couldn't be done. Using vari-speed recording techniques, he altered the speed and pitch of both performances until they matched closely enough to be seamlessly joined together. The transition is almost impossible to detect. It remains one of the greatest technical achievements of the analog recording era and a perfect example of George Martin turning an impossible request into musical history. Number 1. A Day in the Life.
I read the news today, oh boy.
If one recording defines George Martin's brilliance more than any other, it is A Day in the Life. The song began as two unfinished pieces written separately by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. George Martin saw the potential. He created the musical bridge between their contrasting sections, wrote the breathtaking orchestral crescendo for 40 musicians, and encouraged the orchestra to move freely from the lowest notes to the highest, producing one of the most dramatic moments ever captured on tape. Finally, he helped create the legendary closing piano chord, performed simultaneously on multiple pianos and allowed to ring out for nearly a minute. The result wasn't just another Beatles song, it became one of the greatest recordings ever made. More than half a century later, musicians, producers, and recording engineers still study it as a masterpiece of composition, arrangement, and production. The Beatles changed music forever because they constantly imagined sounds no one had heard before. George Martin made those sounds possible. His classical training gave structure to their creativity. His technical knowledge solved problems no one else could solve. Most importantly, he never treated the recording studio as simply a place to capture performances. He treated it as an instrument. That philosophy helped redefine what popular music could become. Without George Martin, the Beatles would still have been extraordinary songwriters, but with George Martin beside them, they became pioneers who forever changed the art of recording itself. Perhaps that is why decades after his passing, George Martin is still remembered not simply as the Beatles' producer, but as the quiet genius who helped shape some of the greatest recordings in music history.